Back in the 16th century, the city of St Etienne in France, which is located just 60 kilometers southwest of Lyon, was an industrial town and a coal mining town. And that's where a lot of hard men came to work and to live. And this weekend, 23 hard men from Fiji and 23 hard men from Australia came to play rugby there in the 2023 Rugby World Cup. G'day and welcome to Inside Rugby. My name is Mark. I'm a Kiwi rugby fan living here in beautiful Cancun in Mexico. And the sun is shining again. And boy, did we have some fantastic rugby over the weekend. And one of those games, of course, was the game between Australia and Fiji, played at St Etienne in the southwest of France. And this was a really interesting game for a number of reasons. We all know that this Pool C is a very interesting pool in this year's Rugby World Cup, and there's plenty of things going on that we need to take notice of. So I'm going to give a fairly detailed review of the game between Fiji and Australia, because not only was it a history-making game again for Fijian rugby, but there were also some warning signs that I think we need to be aware of as Fiji goes forward in this year's tournament. And listen, I don't want to steal the thunder from the Fijians, because they were absolutely fantastic. And of course, I'm from down in that part of the world, and I love the Fijian brothers just as much as anybody does. And let's face it, they're fast becoming the favourite team of many, many people across the world when it comes to this year's Rugby World Cup. So one of the interesting things that I was looking for going into this game was, first of all, the selection of the Australian team. And of course, they had Will Skelton, who was in jeopardy from a couple of days ago when he did a calf in training. And Eddie Jones was playing a few mind games with this one once again, because he was not trying to give too much away. But it was obvious as soon as this news came out that Will Skelton, for me anyway, wasn't going to play in this game. And that was a big factor, I think, for the Australians, because I really like Will Skelton. Not only does he have the big physical presence on the field, but he's also turning into a good leader, not only of the forwards, but of course he has been the captain of this Wallaby group. And I think his mission from this game for Australia was a really, really big point. And Eddie Jones was confident that the Australians were going to get the job done against the Fijians. On the flip side, Fiji were coming off that loss against Wales, which really would have hurt them psychologically, but it also would have given them a lot of positivity, because they finished that game very, very strongly, and they probably knew they could come out and give the Wallabies a hard time in St Etienne, and that's exactly what happened. So let's have a look at the game now, and I'll give you my perspective on how things unfolded. As always, as I watched this game, I was focused on the discipline of both teams, and we started off in the first few minutes and penalties started flowing straight away as both teams were trying to get ascendancy in the game and the forwards were trying to take control. It was obvious that Fiji and their forward pack had turned up to take the Wallabies on up front, and it was going to be really interesting to see how that battle unfolded, and neither team were giving too much away in the first 10 minutes or so of the game. And that's where we saw quite a few penalties coming through for both teams. But it was in the third minute that Fiji got pinged for a high tackle against the Australians, and Ben Donaldson, who was playing again at fullback, good choice. I really liked the way that he played in Australia's first game against Georgia. Ben Donaldson stood up, took the penalty, and was successful in putting Australia out to 3-0. And one of the things that was really interesting in this game was going to be the psychology. You know, Fiji hadn't beaten Australia since 1954. So we're talking 60 plus years since Fiji had a win. And Australia won the last 18 games against Fiji. So we all know this is a different Fiji team. And we're moving into a new era of world rugby. And boy, these Fijians are really showing that. So after the Donaldson penalty from Australia, Fiji got the ball. They got a lot of possession in that first 10 minutes, I think around about 65% in fact, and they started showing their attacking awareness. Now there was one thing that I was really interested in how Fiji were going to play this game, because I thought if Simon Ravili, the coach of Fiji, was going to bring in a very open and expansive game, I thought that was going to be detrimental to Fiji's chances in this game. And the reason for that is because Australia are a very counter-attacking team. And if Fiji opened it up really wide, I thought there was too much threat from all of the Australian backs of being able to pick the ball up, run back at Fiji, and convert opportunities into scores. So that was one thing I was really interested in. That first 10 minutes, Fiji started to show that they wanted to keep the ball close, they wanted to control the ball, have the ball in hand, and I thought this was the start of a very good strategy in this game by Fiji. So on the 11th minute mark, Fiji got a penalty down in the Australian 22, and their halfback Kuru Volley, and we're going to be mentioning that guy's name quite a bit in this video, stood up and took his first kick for the day. Hadn't seen this guy kick before, and boy did he have a very precision technical skills in kicking penalty goals. And that first one was one of many that were to come off the boot of Kuru Volley in this particular game. To take penalties, he was very decisive in the way that he kicked that ball, which was fantastic to see. Look, I mentioned in previous videos about the absence of Caleb Muntz from this Fijian team, and I thought they were going to miss him for two main reasons. One is goal kicking, and secondly his awareness around the game management of the Fijian team. And Kuru Volley showed me in that first few minutes of this game how he's really taken that role, and he's the general of moving the Fijian forwards around. But when it comes to goal kicking, he's more than a handy replacement for Caleb Muntz as well. So it's good to see Fiji have other players stepping up to the mark in this area of the game. Now, in the first 20 minutes of this game, the ascendancy was going towards the Fijians because they were winning the breakdowns, and the reason they were doing that is they went in with speed and accuracy, and this was again a really clever strategy from the Fijians, because if you look at the back three from Australia, you've got Hooper, McWright and Valentini, and those guys are very, very good in the breakdown. So Fiji wanted to disrupt the Australian breakdown situation, make sure they got in there fast and cleared the ball out, and they really got ascendancy in the first 20 minutes of the game through that. And again, through having 65% or so of the possession really helped them. So Fiji in that first 20 minutes were playing a really clever thinking man's game of rugby, and it was getting Australia a little bit rattled because Australia were expecting Fiji, I think, to come out and play that very open and expansive game. They did run the ball a lot, Fiji. They made 315 meters in that first 20 minutes of play, but it was very structured and they were very controlled. So they weren't just throwing it around like Sevens style. They were hitting the ball up, they were getting good turnover ball, and their forwards, I thought, were doing a fantastic job. Two in particular, Mata at number 8 and Levani Botia, who is just a fantastic player, and he never stops. And those two in particular for Fiji were making those clean outs much more effective on their side of the field. Another breakdown penalty for Fiji, and Kuru Volley got up again and put the next penalty over. He never looked like missing when he was stepping up to the tee to take a penalty kick, and Fiji deservedly at that stage went into the lead 6 points to 3, and I thought they were playing really clever rugby. Australia were getting a little bit lost in terms of Carter Gordon again, and a lot of their players were breaking down when Gordon got the ball, either through him not directing passes in the right place, and what I mean by that, he was passing behind the player coming onto the ball, which made it difficult for Australia to get momentum on attack, and he was just making some bad choices when it came to either kicking the ball when Australia had a good attacking opportunity, or not putting the player through the gap as intended when the Australian backs were taking off. So Carter Gordon, again, for me, was just lacking those top end skills in being able to manage the game from number 10 for Australia. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Carter Gordon, so let me know in the comments if you agree with me or not. I think he's just struggling to find his head in the 10 position for Australia, and he knows there's a lot of pressure on him, and I don't think that's really helping, although the team's getting around him and they're obviously giving him a lot of love and support. That only goes so far, and at the end of the day the guy's got to deliver on the pitch, and he's just not up to that standard. But let's move on with the game, and around the 23rd minute something really significant happened in the game, and I want to talk about one player in particular throughout this particular phase of play that a lot of people give a lot of kudos for in the game of rugby for Fiji. Now, what happened around that 23rd minute mark was Nick White for Australia put in a really good 50-22 kick down into the Fijian 22. And the ball bounced out over the touchline and went towards the advertising hoardings. And Sami Radradra was there for Fiji. And what he did was quite interesting. He just looked at the ball bouncing. It was right in front of him. And what he could have done is he could have picked the ball up and delayed any of the Australians for getting their hands on it if he had good game awareness, but he didn't do that. And Mark Nawa Kwantawasi came along for Australia, saw the opportunity to take a really quick throw-in, got the ball into Karevi, I think it was, and then got the ball back from them and scored a try for Australia. And that could have all been stopped if Radradra had got the ball when it went out, held onto it for a little bit, waited for his forwards to come back, handed the ball to Australia, and Australia would not have scored that try. So Radradra has made a couple of bad decisions since I've been watching him, both in the Wales game, and I'm not just talking about the ball that he unfortunately didn't pick up to win that game for Fiji or give them a chance of winning that game, but I'm talking about in other sections of play where he's gone into the tackle and given away a penalty by a slow release of the ball. So I know he's a great player, I know he's been a talisman for Fiji, but there's been a couple of things he's done in this Rugby World Cup that I think Fiji should be sitting down and saying, hey, we got to be a little bit clever, and that was one of those plays when Australia scored their first try. So they went ahead by 8 points to 6 at that stage, and it was an arm wrestle, this game between Australia and Fiji. 3 minutes later and Fiji were back on the attack again, and this is what happened in this game. It was seesawing backwards and forwards with both teams getting a little bit of momentum going and running the ball back at the opposition, although I thought Fiji were doing it a little bit clever in terms of keeping it close, keeping it up through the forwards at times, and putting a lot of pressure around Australia in the inward 5/8 area of the field. But a high tackle by Nick White handed Fiji a penalty, and Kuravoli, who was turning into a kicking masterclass, came up and got the goal for Fiji. So Fiji in the lead after 26 minutes by 9 points to 8. So just after the 31st minute of the first half, Fiji were once again down in the Australian half, putting on some good ruck mauls heading towards the Australian line, and the Australian discipline fell over, giving a penalty to Fiji. Kuravoli came up again, and Mr. Masterclass kicked it over from about 40 metres out, and Fiji took the lead 12 points to 8, and that was the half-time score in this game. And it was a really, really interesting game. Australia weren't able to get into the game in that first half. They were really struggling. And again, a lot of that centred around Carter Gordon's decisions at 5'8". Nick White was also making some bad calls, I thought, at halfback by kicking too much at the wrong time and giving the ball back to Fiji, which they obviously love, and were bringing that ball up. Wayasia Naya Salivu, the captain of Fiji, was once again in a lot of the play, as with Joshua Tuiasova, who was a standout for me for Fiji in both halves of this rugby game until he had to go off. But he was massive in that first half, and at second 5'8", they've really found a fantastic player. So 12-8 to Fiji at half time, and the game was on, that's for sure, and Australia didn't look like they were really, really into this game, and Fiji were controlling it well. But at half time I was thinking, okay, can Fiji maintain this rhythm and momentum for another 40 minutes? That was going to be the key for me, because once they started to get tired and they started to empty the bench, that's when I thought Australia were going to have a really, really good chance in this game. And I thought in the last 20 minutes, Fiji might really struggle. And Australia's ability to be able to counter-attack from anywhere on the field was going to put Fiji under a lot of pressure. So it was important for me that Fiji came out and they kept the same game plan going in the second half. Some other stats from that first half: Fiji got 65% of the possession, so they were doing really, really well and holding on to the ball. And that's something I like about this Fiji team, and we saw it against Wales as well. They weren't making a lot of those kicks downfield and just trying to get territory all the time. They were actually taking the ball up in their forwards. Their forwards did an enormous amount of work in that first half and taking the ball up and setting up different phases of play. And I would have really liked to see the stats around how many different phases of play Fiji got up to in that first half. Australia were let down by discipline in the first half, 7 penalties against them. And that was something I'm sure Eddie Jones would have spoken to them about at half time. but again, it came through the pressure that Fiji were putting on them, particularly in the forwards. And I was wondering whether Fiji's line-out was going to hold together in the second half. This is an area of their game they struggle with when they get tired, and particularly when they bring replacements on. So I was looking for that as we went into the second half. But Fiji started off the second half exactly how they would have wanted to. They went straight into maintaining possession, putting a lot of pressure on Australia, and then an opportunity came ahead for Tuiasova, who did a fantastic kick through from around about just inside the Australian half down the left hand side of the field. It was a foot race between him and a couple of Australians to get the ball inside the in-goal area. The ball didn't go dead. Tuiasova got there first, piled on the ball to score a fantastic try for Fiji, and that would have given Fiji a lot of wind in their sails, starting off the second half with that fantastic try and putting them out to now 17 points to 8. Kuriavoli got the conversion over. Fiji were out to 19-8, but then something really big happened in the game and Kuriavoli went off, and it seemed to be that he was a little bit injured at that time. Limani came on, and I made some comments about Limani in my video after the Wales game. I didn't really like the energy that Limani brought, and he was a bit fragile in a couple of areas of play. First of all, his ball distribution is a bit slow, and secondly, his goal kicking is a little bit temperamental, and we could see that as this game went on, and this started to be a big concern. And it was definitely a turning point in this game against Australia, was when Kuriavoli went off in the 44th minute. And we only had to wait a few more minutes until the 48th minute in the game when Limani got his first opportunity to kick for goal, and he missed it. And I was starting to get a little bit worried for Fiji at this stage, because every time they got opportunities to keep the scoreboard ticking over, I thought this was going to be a very important factor of the game. And that would have put Fiji at that stage out to 22 points to 8, which would have been really significant. And Australia, in the last 20 odd minutes of this game, would have been chasing the scoreboard. By the 63rd minute, the penalty count was up to 13-6 against Australia, and this was really starting to tell on the Australians. Every time they looked like they were going to gain some momentum in this game, Fiji got a penalty and enabled them either to clear the ball or move into a more attacking situation. Now, this pressure that Fiji were building up Australia was coming across the field, so there wasn't any in particular area. And Australia's discipline, I might say, was just the case of being very conscious that Fiji could break the line at any time and put this game way beyond them. So they were very careful in being able to manage that. Now, in the 65th minute, Limani got to redeem himself by getting a penalty over, another Australian indiscretion, and now Fiji kicked out to 22 points to 8. And with only 15 minutes left in the game, it didn't seem as though Australia were going to take this one. But still, I was a little bit nervous in Fiji. They were getting a few injuries and they were making some replacements, and as they did, their game started to fall away a little bit. And one of those injuries was the try scorer Tuiasova, who went off in the 64th minute, and this was a big turning point in the game, because I think it gave Australia some really good psychological opportunity that they were going to be able to break through the Fijian line. And only 1 minute later, they did exactly that from a line out where Fiji was starting to lose the line outs now. Australia went on the attack, and Vunivalu went over for a good try for Australia. So they were back in the game, and it got their tails up. You could tell Australia were looking at coming back to Fiji in the last 15 minutes. So Ben Donaldson got the conversion of Vunivalu's try, and all of a sudden we were back with a game on at 22 points to 15. Australia needed a converted try in the last 12 minutes to draw this game, and of course we all know how tight Pool C is in this Rugby World Cup, so it was game on for that last 12 minutes. Now, Fiji looked very fragile in this last 12 minutes. They lost a lot of lineouts. They looked untidy and clueless when it came to their attack, and they looked a little bit pressurized. And you could tell in the Fijian demeanor that they thought Australia were going to really put them under a lot of pressure, and that's what Australia did. But again, when it came to critical plays in the game, Australia were left wanting. They weren't able to find that right pass, or they kicked the ball when it was not necessarily, and they gave Fiji a lot of possession. And I don't know why Australia wasn't keeping the ball in hand at that stage and running it at the Fijians. Fiji were having trouble in the scrums as well, so their set pieces were falling apart, and it was giving Australia a really good opportunity to get back into this game. And I can't help but wonder if it was New Zealand, France, Springboks or Ireland on the other side of the field against Fiji in this game, they would have really taken advantage of this last 10 or so minutes in the game and put Fiji away. But Australia are not at that level at the moment, and we saw Carter Gordon taken off the field by Eddie Jones. That was a big statement in itself, and Ben Donaldson went into number 10 for the last 12 minutes, and that really made a difference. Australia started to distribute the ball more effectively, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see Ben Donaldson getting a chance after his great game for Australia in their first game against Georgia. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Ben Donaldson moved into that number 10 and Callaway coming back to fullback, or even Carter Gordon getting a start at fullback. So I think there's going to be some play around with this Australian squad. Ben Donaldson looked way much better in at number 10 than Carter Gordon did. And that's what happened. We got to the 80th minute mark and Australia had basically run the clock down. They didn't find a way to get through this Fijian defence. So hats off to Fiji, of course, because they put in a mighty effort, beating Australia for the first time in 69 years. Final score 22-15. Australia weren't able to find that final converted try in the last minutes of this game. But if I were to look at the game now in total, I'd say that Fiji were fantastic in terms of their strategy. They played absolutely brilliantly for about 50 minutes of this game. They delivered the strategy, but they got really found out when they had to bring their reserves on, and they weren't able to maintain that level of play. And I can't help but think this is going to be Fiji's Achilles heel as they go forward in this tournament. They just have to be able to play the 80 minutes at the same level they played the first 50 odd minutes in this particular game. And against other teams with a bigger depth in their squad than what Australia's got, it's going to be a really, really big problem. I know I'm nitpicking a little bit, but I just want to put out an honest video about how I saw the game. And as I said, I think Fiji played fantastically. Obviously they made history again. They've now beaten England and Australia in some of their last games, and nothing can be taken away from that. And they've beaten Australia at a Rugby World Cup, so it doesn't get much bigger as far as the Fijians go. Yeah, Fiji were outstanding. Kuravoli, while he was on the field, was absolute master. Levani, Botia in the forwards, and Mata are the absolute stems of this team for Fiji. They get hungry at breakdown time. They get a lot of ball back for Fiji, and they protect a lot of ball as well. Titi Tila at first five is doing an admirable job in covering for Caleb Muntz. He's not a Caleb Muntz, but he's doing a steady job there at number 10. And Tui Asova, well, this guy could be a World Cup favourite for anybody, because he's really showing how powerful and how fast he is in scoring that brilliant try. So all across the pitch, the Fijians did well. Big question mark over their reserves and their ability to go 80 minutes against a really strong team that's got a lot of depth. But Australia, boy, are they struggling. 1 win from 6 now for Eddie Jones. And this was a game I think they were going to fear all along after coming off that game against Georgia, because Fiji are playing so well. And I'm sure that a lot of the Australian players, once they saw that first 20 or 30 minutes from Fiji, they really knew they were in for a battle in this game, and that's exactly what Fiji brought them. So I think Nick White had a fairly average game at halfback. As I said, he kicked too much ball at the wrong time away for Australia. It wasn't that kind of game. I think Australia would have been better keeping ball in hand. They've got to remember they've got Jordan Pataya, Karevi and Mark Nawa Quantawasi out there on the wing for them, and they look very dangerous when those guys get the ball. And Donaldson at fullback as well. He looks really, really good when he comes in. So I don't think the strategy was good at all from Australia around their 9 and 10 positions. And also some of their forwards went missing as well, because the Fijis put on a really good scrum in the first half of this game. And Richie Arnold did a couple of silly things that cost Australia penalties as well, and I'm sure Eddie Jones would have got up him at half time and after the game, because they were silly points. And Fraser McWright, Tom Hooper and Rob Valentina, the back three for Australia, I would have thought they would have done better against Fiji, but they didn't. And I think Fiji won that battle in the loose heads for this particular game. So Radreka, I think that silly error where he could have been a little bit more conscious of what was going on around him when that 50-22 from Nick White went out. If he'd got hold of that ball, held on to it, waited for the forwards to come up, then given Australia the ball, stopped that opportunity from them going for the fast line out, they could have saved that try, and that could have put a lot more pressure back on Australia at the time. So it's little details like that in these Rugby World Cup games that make a huge difference. Australia will be upset with their discipline once again. They gave away far too many penalties in this game, and I thought Fiji were really good in keeping all of their players on the field as well, because sometimes that's an area where they get let down and they end up playing with 14 or even 13 men. So they kept all their players on the field. Their fitness was struggling a little bit towards the end. Some of the replacements were really struggling. Don't talk to me about heat this weekend, because if you've been to Fiji, you know how hot it is where these players are playing week in, week out. They should be used to it. So it comes down to high performance coaching and getting these players at a condition where they can go for the period of time that they're on the field. If you come on in the 55th minute, you should be able to go to the end of the game full throttle in these particular matches, and some of those Fijian players were not able to do that. Fiji's got to shore up that line out in the second half. They were really at threat from Australia, and they weren't getting any ball to secure. So if this game had got really close, maybe if it was a draw at the time and we still had 4 or 5 minutes to play, I thought Fiji were under a lot of threat. But nevertheless, they won. It was a fantastic game by Fiji. It's what everybody wanted to see in the stadium, that's for sure. Australia's got to go away. I don't know where they go from here. There's a lot of soul searching going on in that team, and I don't know honestly now whether Eddie Jones can bring it together for this Australian team. So there we go. There's my review of the Australian versus Fiji game in the Rugby World Cup. Pool C game played in St Etienne this weekend. It was a really great game of rugby. Had everybody sitting on the edge of their seats to the last minute, because you never know what's going to happen with this Fijian team. And if you're like me, you surely didn't want them to lose that game after being ahead for all of the game, or most of it anyway. And that's the way it ended up. So drop me your comments. Let me know what you thought of the game. Were there any standout players for you? What does Australia have to do? And just don't write get rid of Eddie Jones. I want to know what strategy they need to be bringing to these games to win them. I really look forward to reading your comments on that. Okay, plenty more going on this week with the Rugby World Cup. We've got that cliffhanger of a game coming up next weekend between Ireland and the Springboks. For me, that could be a World Cup final game. It's not, so we'll have to watch it with a great pleasure. I'm going to be making a preview of that game as soon as the two teams are announced. So the way that you should stick around is hit the subscribe button, give me some love, thumbs up for this video, share it with all your brothers in Fiji, and I'll look forward to making another one very soon for you. Until then, stay well, stay safe everybody. Keep enjoying the 2023 Rugby World Cup from France. It's a fantastic tournament, and there's still some amazing rugby to come. Until next time, bye for now.